Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Geoff, the author of Forging Democracy, The History of the Left in Europe, 1850 to 2000. Welcome to Rip Rap, Geoff. As you point out in your preface, this book is written, as you say, from great passion and great regret over 2 decades. A project long enough to be conceived in one era but completed in another. Could you please share how you became involved with this topic and why you say that it required a willingness to rethink and surrender some valued assumptions and deeply cherished beliefs?
Well, I think the passion obviously comes from my own identification with the left. I'm very much a child of the 60s. That's when I came of age politically. I entered my adult life very strongly committed to the democratic values and larger political projects of the socialist parties and communist parties that were still an active and usually quite central feature of the political landscape in most of Europe. So the passion is one of identification with a set of political ideals. The regret is obviously to do with the collapse of those political movements over the period of my lifetime, and in particular the crisis that those movements entered during the course of the 1980s, dramatically exemplified obviously by the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, but also I think present in the long-term decay of the socialist parties in Western Europe too. So the regret is very much to do with the sense of an ending, because even though any of that political identification and passionate engagement that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, even though that identification long abandoned the Soviet Union and the state socialist regimes in Eastern Europe, which was certainly not part of my understanding of democratic and progressive political values in that period of growing up in the 60s and 70s that I mentioned. Even though the Soviet Union and the socialist regimes of Eastern Europe were not part of my particular, my positive universe of democratic socialist commitments, nonetheless, the collapse of the Soviet Union and all its ramifications and all the complicated reverberations necessarily, I think, precipitated a clearer understanding on those of us, on the part of those of us who see ourselves on the left, that a long historical period was effectively coming to an end, and that's the regret. Now, I should also say, though, that as well as the sense of an ending, my book also tries to convey beginnings, and my ambition in this book was not only to characterize the rise and fall of a particular kind of left-wing politics. It was also an attempt to try and find in the long present that we've been living through, which, as I've said already, for me begins in the 1960s, to find in the long present that we've been living through the seeds or the potentials, the possibilities for a left politics that could be reimagined or reconstructed.
The thing that fascinated me was that you have all these different countries in Europe. There is, while there is an assumption that there's a kind of monolithic, or there's some kind of universal kind of, or some kind of standardized existence or political ideology that in fact isn't true. That, and I thought was fascinating with your book is how you showed the differences between Spain and England and France, Russia, and then the Russia as part of the Soviet Union, and after it broke apart, then there were all different kinds of trajectories with those countries. But that also seemed to make it infinitely more complex to track all that information.
It was extremely important to me that this book encompass Europe as a whole in some real way. I mean, European history, as it's usually taught and practiced, very often means Western European history, and within the West, European history invariably means some combination of France, Germany, Britain, maybe Italy, and so on. And it was extremely important to me that the book address the history of the left, or the conditions of democratic political development, in both gross parts of Europe, East and West, and also in ways that were sensitive to the kinds of regional variations and regional patterns that you just mentioned.
And you also give the intellectual foundations, as we're going through it, how that, what that came from, and what the specific ideological structures were, and that's again much more complex. It's easy to take one slice through the pile, and I think that's been the tendency, but to have to try to encompass the totality of it is pretty staggering.
Well, again, it was also really important to me in writing the book that it be an integrated account, so that it be neither simply a history of the left political tradition, so a kind of a political and intellectual history of those movements in this long period, nor simply a social history of the bases of support that those movements relied upon. I mean, I really wanted to try and combine social and political and intellectual and cultural history in a single integrated account. And that's obviously kind of a big project. And actually that can bring us back to that first question you asked, because when I conceived the book, which was really in the early 1980s, I was motivated by two things in particular. Firstly, I wanted to revisit the history of the tradition, so to speak. So I wanted to take another look at the history of the political movements and the intellectual traditions that the left has represented, in the light of all the advances in social history that had been generated in the period between the 1960s and then, between the 1960s and when I first started this book, which was in the early 1980s. And of course, that was the period when the discipline of history was completely transformed by this extraordinary upsurge of interest in social history. So that the history of these movements had to be, I thought, revisited and rewritten in the light of the advances that social historians had the advances of knowledge, that is, that social historians had brought to the table by that time. So I wanted to take another look at the history of the tradition in the light of the social history that was being produced. But I also wanted to revisit the earlier periods in the history of the tradition in the light of the political and theoretical crises that tradition was already passing through in the 1980s.
Well, and I thought it was interesting that you note this in your preface and so forth, in acknowledgments. There were all these groups of other people that you were getting insights and bouncing ideas off of. And I think that's really reflected, because the historiography is broader, and benefited from maybe knowledge or, the strategic interpretation of different events. But particularly in different countries, I think it's hard to know some of the interior stuff with Czechoslovakia or...
Right, right. Well, I've been extraordinarily fortunate in my my career as a historian in having worked in a series of extraordinarily supportive and exciting contexts. You know, first in Cambridge in the second half of the 1970s, Cambridge in the United Kingdom, that is. And then since 1979 at the University of Michigan, and of course those contexts are also sort of larger than the particular places that I've been teaching and working in, because they include the networks of colleagues and friends and colleagues that one also, you know, has as a home when you're a historian. And of course I'm a German historian by immediate training, and so one part of that network is my friends and colleagues in German history. But there are many other networks of that kind as well. And the book, whatever virtues the book possesses, certainly presuppose like a long series of conversations with friends and colleagues in other fields. And of course, you know, the size of the bibliography also indicates...
Yeah, about 100 pages.
The degree to which a book of this kind can only subsist. It can only subsist on the contributions of a small army of other people.
The other thing I thought we might talk about is, what is your concept of democracy? What does it mean? And it's a core concept in this book, obviously. And maybe you could share your definition, how you use it. And then your warning that democracy is not a given, did not, at least in Europe, result from a natural evolution or economic prosperity, nor emerge as an inevitable byproduct of individualism or the market, but from conflict, from masses of people organized collectively to demand it.
Right. Again, going back to the beginnings of this book, and I've obviously talked already about the history of the left political tradition and the ways that I hoped to illuminate that. And of course, when I discussed the book at its various stages with friends and colleagues, mostly the immediate assumption was this was a history of socialism. And that's certainly a key part of the core of the book. But it was always really important to my understanding of this project that the history of the left is much larger than that, and I decided at a very early stage of the thinking that my preferred definition, and the one that I'm most comfortable with politically, is really about democracy. Now, what do I mean by democracy? Well, democracy is obviously a complicated thing, and my preferred starting point is really a juridical one, and we don't get anywhere, in my view, unless we begin from, you know, constitutions and civil rights and protections of the law and political liberties in that juridical sense. At the same time, democracy and the conditions that sustain it and everything that's necessary to provide its supports, everything entailed in the creation and the securing and the expansion of democratic political goods is much larger than that juridical definition. And in those terms, I've tried to put this in terms of democratic political capacities. And I want that idea to draw attention both to the social contexts in which democratic values have to be secured, and to the possibility of pushing those values into areas of life that aren't immediately recognizable through that strict political definition. So it seems to me that democracy in its fullest sense applies not only to the public sphere of political activity and of political contestation, that we use, ideas of constitutions and political liberties and civil rights and the protections of the law to describe. Democracy in its fullest sense, it seems to me, also applies to everything else, from the economy through social relationships to the private sphere and relations between men and women, parents and children, friends, in neighborhoods and in families. And so my understanding of democracy begins with constitutional rights and protections of the law, but it certainly doesn't stop there. And one of the things that I wanted most sort of fervently to achieve in this book is to indicate all of the ways in which that democratic ideal has not only been grounded in a set of social histories, but has also, over this period as a whole, between the mid-19th century and the present, been pushed ever more ambitiously into new areas of life and experience. And I wanted to craft a definition of the left that was adequate to all of those complexities. So, for instance, one of the most important aspects of my understanding of the history of the left is feminism, for instance, and all the complicated areas that we now try to address in our social analysis, cultural analysis, and political understanding through the concept of gender. And so, and that really has not been a very very sort of solid and recognizable presence in most of the available histories of the left, so, that we've had to rely on before, and nor was it was that understanding of the importance of gender a very secure part of the history of the left political tradition itself for most of this 150-year period. And so, if we go back to what I was saying a few minutes ago about the ways in which I originally conceived the book in the early 1980s in relation to all the social history that was being produced, and in relation to the contemporary rethinking that was occurring on the left, then women's history and gender history on the one hand, which has, during the last 20 years, transformed our understanding of the social history of the last 200 years, and feminist critiques of contemporary politics, including the established politics of the left as they were in the early 1980s, is very much a part of that set of starting points.
There is kind of a very distinctive process that you're going through. It just seems like the power of the peoples was shed ideologies or previous ways of thought, like snakes shed skins. I mean, people would think, well, this might work, or some leader think, well, this strategy would work, and if it didn't match up with where the people were going, it was left behind, and there were some really dramatic moments along the way. 1989 being one of them.
Yes. I mean, just to give you another illustration of what I mean by this expansive understanding of democracy, rather than one being rather than a definition that's sort of tied strictly to questions of constitutional rights and protections under the law. One of the most obvious limitations of democracy, until relatively recently historically, has been precisely its gendered limitations. So that if we're to apply a very strict definition of democratic political goods, of democracy, virtually nowhere qualifies until after the First World War, simply because the franchise was restricted to men. And in fact, there are only 4 states in the world before 1918, 2 of them in, before 1914, 2 of them in Europe, where women had the vote. And so one of the ways in which I try to, one of the more obvious ways in which I try to point both to the continuous expansion of the boundaries of democracy in the 19th and 20th centuries, and to the distressing kind of limitations of those gains, is in relation to women's political rights and women's citizenship. And in the same vein, it's in these powerful and dramatic moments of pan-European change, or of transnational change, where big advances politically, in democratic terms, where big advances are made across Europe as a whole, rather than just 1 or 2 countries. You know, these big moments that I've called constitution-making moments, constitution-making conjunctures, 1860s, 1917 to the early 1920s, the period after the Second World War, and then 1989. In those big moments, it's not only that the constitutional boundaries of citizenship get expanded, it's also that a context is created in which people's imagination takes off. And it becomes possible precisely to imagine democratic gains being made in these areas that we don't always recognize as susceptible to democratic organization, whether it's the economy or whether it's local communities outside the structures of local government, or whether it's inside, you know, the very private domain of the family or of personal relationships. It's precisely in these big moments that the most utopian ideas about the possible organization of democracy get produced, right? And that's also a very important part of what I tried to do in the book, namely to reaffirm the importance of revolutionary, dramatic revolutionary breakthroughs, because it's in those big moments that I listed that revolutionary breakthroughs can occur. And of course, revolutions are also extremely, as well as being extremely inspiring and exciting moments of change where the horizon of possible thought and action gets dramatically pushed outwards. I mean, they're also extremely violent and dangerous moments. And it seems to me that we've been in a period now for the last 10 to 15 years where in which it's become extremely difficult to make a positive case for these big moments of dramatic progress in the extent and possible boundaries of democracy. It's been very hard to make a case for the importance of revolutions in this positive and progressive and, I'd argue, necessary sense. One of the things that I wanted to do in the book also is to remind us all that the really important gains democratically have only ever been made through these very dangerous, very inspiring, very violent moments of revolutionary crisis.
A democracy, I think, is only as good as its informed memory.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true, yeah.
Books like yours go a long way toward that goal, I think, where we have the detail and the background and the foundations for what it is that's been happening.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we can ever have enough information like that.
That's my hope as well, obviously. I mean, actually, one of the things I wanted to do in the last part of the book, from 1968 to the present, is for the first time because I think that this is the first time that somebody's trying to do this, in all cautious modesty. I wanted to try and build a coherent narrative for this period, and to try and bring together all these disparate histories, not just divided by country, but also between different parts of the left, socialist parties, communist parties, contemporary extra-parliamentary movements, the women's movement, the peace movement, grassroots movements. So to try and create a sort of a coherent narrative framework for understanding all of that together. And part of that also involved telling some stories about individuals, because people get into history partly because books like this try to place them there. There are different ways in which I try to exemplify the larger developments by using a particular individual story. That was also an important part of what I wanted to do.
Well, it's what I would call a prodigious book, in the full meaning of that word. Thank you for being on Rip Rap.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.